What's up guys, this is Eddie from Lil Soy. We're back again for the second episode of 3. Today we're going to be talking about how to flip samples into beats creatively. So I'm going to be dropping about 5 tips on how to creatively manipulate the samples that you use to turn them into your own creative work. So first off, we've got this drum sample that I downloaded from LANDR. We've got it here, we're going to drag it in. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to sample the drum hits in this, but we want to go for this lazy sort of drum feel, so we're going to half speed it. Basically the function that we're going to use is the slice to MIDI track, and we're going to set it to transient, and basically that means every time there's a drum hit, it's going to slice it to a new pad, then built-in slicing preset, and then we'll click OK. It's going to create a MIDI track that contains a drum rack full of the different slice samples. And it's also going to create a MIDI clip that contains all the notes in the proper timing to recreate the original sample. And if we double time that, it's basically the original sample. But of course we're not going to use this MIDI clip. We're going to record in our own MIDI clip that uses the same drum hits of the sample but a different rhythm. So now if you go to your MIDI keyboard and play some of the notes. Finally, the last thing you have to do before you record it in is turn off the loop speed. See how these loop? Just turn it down. And now it's a one shot. Okay, so we're going to record in a simple pattern here. So we found our hi-hats. And we're going to record in a simple hi-hat pattern, but make sure you have this plus enabled. This makes sure that it adds to the MIDI clip instead of deletes everything. And let's go ahead and record it in. So now we're just going to go into the MIDI clip by double clicking it. You can hit Control U or go to quantize settings to make sure that we've got the right parameters. In this case, we're going to click 1/8 and 1/8 triplet and set the amount to 50%. So now we're going to add some processing and effects on the drums and on the master. First off, we're going to add the drum bus to this. The drum bus basically utilizes compression and transient shaping to bring out the punch and kick of the drums or bass. So we'll drag it in, turn up the crunch and boom. And we'll turn down the mix to about 50%. Next, we're going to add in some vintage emulation. We're going to start with DAW Cassette. This plugin basically emulates the sound of a cassette recording by introducing noise and saturation. So we'll tweak the settings and then turn down the mix because we don't want it to mix in too much, and that'll introduce a more vintage sound to it. Finally, we're going to add in one more vintage processing emulator. It's going to be Super VHS. I'm going to turn on the magic button, turn up the heat a little bit, and the wash. And finally, we're going to add in this vinyl crackle underneath everything that we've also sourced from LANDR. We have it here. I'll just drag it in as an underlay to all the sounds that are coming up. Alright, next we're going to focus on a really helpful tip in flipping samples and turning them into your own original material. We're going to take this sample right here from the website. Got it here. We're going to drag it in. But this sample is double the length, so we're going to select the other two and do Control D to duplicate it, then select the whole thing, do Control L to loop it. Now I could just loop that and call it a day. But what we're going to do is use the reverse function to change this up. But the special part is we're going to be reversing each section while keeping it in the same order. This is really helpful if you want to reverse a sample and switch it up while keeping the overall structure, the harmonic progression, etc. So what we're going to do is select each section and click R to reverse it. We're going to turn up the reverb on the loop and on the drums, just to give it a little bit more room space. Alright, so the next tip is we're going to be using the warp mode in the clip editor to be able to tweak or edit the rhythms of a sample. So in the third bar of this loop, If we take a listen, there's one little spot that I wish would hit on the beat a little bit more, and with the warp editor, there's a really easy way to just correct these sort of things. So if you ever hear something that's off beat, all you have to do is make sure that the warp is enabled. I usually use the complex warp mode. So what we're going to do is focus on the second beat of this sample. By looping it, we can hear that there's one part that I wish was a little bit more on beat. So what we're going to do is create an anchor over here so it doesn't shift the entire sample when we shift this part. We're also going to create another anchor here. And if we zoom in, I want this part to hit a little bit forward. I want the second hit to also be moved a little bit forward. And I want this third hit as well to be on the beat. So if you listen to it now, so now I've got all the parts hitting on the beat. If you don't want it to be magnetized and sticking to the grid like it is here, you can just hold down the Option key to get the fine-tuning details set up. And this last tip is going to focus on how to take a second melodic sample and make it work well with an existing composition or an existing sample setup that we have here. So what I like about the sample is the vinyl texture, the crackle, the accented notes on the Rhodes, but what I'm worried about is it's not going to work with the key or the vibe of the original sample that we have here. So we're going to drag it in, turn up the gain, and clearly off the bat it doesn't really work harmonically, it's not really in the key. So what we're going to do is work with the first note. If we pitch it up, that kind of works better. But then we listen to the second and third notes, it also doesn't work out so well. So the easiest fix for this is to select just those notes, Control X, Control V, cut it out, paste it again, and then we'll bring down the semitones until it works. This second note also doesn't work, Control X, Control V, bring it down to 4 semitones up. Do the same thing for here, but now we can go down a little bit lower even, down to 2. So what we're going to do is select just the first half, then Control D to duplicate it. So now I've got the full loop. Turn up the reverb bus. And with a close listen, it still doesn't sound totally right. And I think that's because of the sort of dropping notes after the original accented notes. If you listen to just this and the reverse sample together, it's the notes that come after the accented notes that don't really work in the key. So what we'll do to fix that is first we'll apply some compression, because you see that the peaks of the second and third notes are much higher than the first. And for the next step after this, we're going to require compression. So let's add in that first. Set the threshold down to here. And then to get out those trailing notes, we're going to use a noise gate, which cuts out any audio of a sample past the volume threshold that we set. So double click the gate, and obviously with default settings, it's not very helpful in capturing what we want. So we're going to turn down the threshold so it captures the notes that we want, but doesn't capture the ones that we don't. We can turn on the look ahead to 10 milliseconds so that it looks forward a little bit more to anticipate the cutoff. Turn up the attack a little bit and the hold to make it a little bit more soft. And that's exactly what we don't want. So finally, if you hear that little blip after this section, that's just something that the gate can't really cut out because it's the same volume as some of the other notes that we want. So what we'll do is just select that and click 0 to deactivate that section of the clip. Duplicate again. Now that we've turned up the reverb bus on that, mix it in a little bit better. Here's the full beat so far. The last simple tip to making these samples work together is some basic EQ. We know that this sample is a little bit on the high end, and this one's more on the mids to lows. So we'll use an EQ to gently high pass the second sample and gently low pass the first sample. So there's the final beat. To recap, we basically just took 4 sounds derived from samples and we chopped them up, rearranged them to turn them into something a little bit more creative. First up, we use the slice to MIDI track function, which slices up the sample based on the grid or based on the transient/drum hits and creates a new MIDI track with the sound so that you can rearrange them. Then we use vintage processing such as DAW Cassette, VHS, as well as the vinyl crackle that we underlaid to create a more vintage texture. Next up, we use this reverse function to change up the sample, but we kept the harmonic structure of the loop by just reversing each bar at a time. And then we use the warp mode in this part of the sample to make sure that it hit on time. Finally, with that loop set up with the drums, we took the second melodic sample and tweaked it using the transpose functions and taking each note and transposing a different amount so that it worked with the key of the first sample. Finally, we used some compression to even out the peaks, and then we used a noise gate to catch only the notes that we wanted and cut out the rest. Finally, we added some reverb to the sample and then used some EQ to high pass this one, low pass the second sample, and just sort of sculpt the drums. Hope you guys enjoyed. All these samples, as always, are in the artist collection that I created with LANDR. Be sure to subscribe to their account and mine in the description, and stay tuned for episode 3.
Subscribe.